Welcome to the Artisan Podcast, where we share insights from the investment world's leading minds. Today, we will discuss how to successfully sell your business with Andrew Abdalla, a partner at M&P and one of Canada's leading experts on mid-market M&A. I've known Andrew for many years, and he's always proven insightful with a deep knowledge of his craft. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Joseph. Happy to be here today.
Absolutely a pleasure. So, let's start off with the M&A market itself. It's been extremely hot. Is it still booming? And do you expect it to remain that way in a rising rate environment?
Things are, as you say, very, very buoyant right now in the market. There have been a lot of transactions in the last 18, 19 months. When COVID first hit, there was a lot of uncertainty. A lot of deals got stalled that were in process. But then, a few months into it, people realized life goes on, business goes on. People still need products and services. By and large, we've seen very, very few bankruptcies, major setbacks in most businesses, bars, restaurants accepted and travel different. But in the rest of the business world, it's been generally a very good year. So yes, we're seeing transactions. Every firm has a large backlog of transactions. If anything, there's perhaps a shortage of businesses to buy. Lots of buyers out there, maybe a lack of sellers right now, but still more transactions that we've seen in the last 6 months than we've saw, say, 2 and 3, 4 years before. Active market. What will it look like as interest rates start to inch up? I still think it's going to be very, very active, just because of the growth opportunities down the road. A lot of businesses are going to be inflation protected, so they'll be able to move their pricing and their revenue with the increased inflation and interest rate rising that we're seeing in the market. So as long as they can keep ahead of it, there's no reason why, businesses should not go up in value and acquisitions be accretive to purchasers.
And below the surface, what do you see as the major themes? Like, are certain industries hotter than others? Are certain industries basically everyone is staying away from? And more structurally, what do you think is driving this? Is it the fact that there's this generation of entrepreneurs that are now getting towards retirement age? And their children really, they don't want to be in that business. Maybe it's manufacturing, maybe if it's something more boring. So what do you see as kind of the near-term cyclical trends, but also the longer-term structural ones?
A few things have happened. And yes, you're correct that there is a bit of a generational and market change, that a number of entrepreneurs, and especially in Quebec and in Canada, have reached an age where they need to start thinking of the next generation and also what they want to do personally in their lives. Businesses get sold for all sorts of reasons. People change, they want to do something else, they're tired of their business, they see more opportunities elsewhere. So I think that's part of it. The low interest rate environment that we've had for the last several years also makes it much easier for a buyer to acquire a business. There's been a receptive financial and capital market. When I started in this business, you could only borrow essentially against hard assets, whether it was fixed assets, inventory, backed perhaps by receivables as well. There weren't very many lenders out there that were lending against future cash flow of a business. So that business has developed in the last 20 years from nothing to being a very, very large part of where entrepreneurs, acquirers go out and buy businesses. So that market has developed. The pricing has come down on that. When I started, those cash flow loans were being done at 15 to 20% interest to acquire a business. And today we're seeing cash flow loans being done at 4, 5, and 6%.
Mm.
So we're back to rates that we saw initially on hard assets such as business. So that market has developed. We've had also support from private equity companies that are coming in and going through a lot of consolidation and roll up strategies. So that's a
Mm.
little bit of a structural change on the financial end, but
Right.
also a change on the market end where a lot of businesses now realize that they can grow domestically and internationally in a virtual world.
Right.
So that's been a pandemic structural change that I think will continue. You know, I
Mm.
was looking at a transaction last week for a computer services support desktop roll up strategy across
Mm.
Canada, where all that work used to be done by technicians that would physically go into somebody's office. Now
Mm.
it's all being done remotely. So again, a structural change in the business marketplace
Mm.
that has enabled that type of activity.
Right. Right. And what do you see as kind of the big trends for the next 5 or 10 years? Like maybe some of the past ones will continue, or maybe there'll be some new ones. What are your thoughts there?
I think we're going to see more and more foreign buyers into the Canadian market
Okay.
as things have become globalized. I think we're going to see that. We're going to see Canadian companies being going outside of Canada as well. We've been
Mm.
seeing, you know, Canadian companies go to the U.S. for several years, but now we're seeing more into Europe than I've ever seen. We've
Mm.
seen European companies come into Canada, especially in
Mm.
some sectors like real estate. We've seen a lot of European acquirers of Montreal real estate, especially in residential space. So that is going to continue. Other trends, consolidations, roll-ups, specialty products and services that
Mm.
didn't exist 5 and 10 years ago. So think of all the financial tech world, medical world. We're seeing that being expanded from small and mid-market companies, where that used
Mm.
to be really for the large companies.
Mm.
Telecom technology, 5G technology is bringing about a lot of new
Okay.
industries and businesses, Internet
Mm.
of Things, autonomous driving. All these new sectors didn't exist 5 and 10 years ago, and we're starting to see a lot of activities, especially in Montreal and Toronto now.
Mm.
That is really nice to see that we're actually on the forefront of some of these new growth industries.
And I was wondering, something that I've seen in the last little while are PE firms that are scouring some of the industrials, particularly close to transportation hubs on the outskirts of the city and near the airport, and basically looking to acquire them for their land and building, not for, because those kind of last mile real estate have gone up so much in value, and there's such little supply that businesses are being bought just for their real estate. Is that something that you're seeing as well?
Well, one of the things that you can't help noticing when you pick up, in newspapers, you're reading about all the supply chain issues that have occurred during the pandemic. So it was
Mm.
somewhat COVID related. We had some weather issues. We had, a big boat in the Nile. We had some rail strikes, rail breakdowns, chip shortages that are driving cars and trucks.
Hmm.
So you're reading about all these supply chain issues, and add to that port congestions in Los Angeles, and now it's starting even in Canada, and a shortage of containers.
Mm.
So, there's a big shortage of containers. Those that have done well have their containers. Shortage of truck drivers.
Hmm.
We're seeing action in the M&A world, a transaction I'm involved in a shipping logistics company, and they're a hot commodity right now. They've
Mm.
got physical assets, land and building, as you mentioned. They've got
Hmm.
containers, they've got trucks, and they've got shippers. We're seeing it in rates. Rates are going through the roof. My girlfriend works in men's apparel, and she was telling me to ship a container from China of apparel to Canada used to be about $5,000 to
Mm,
cross the ocean. Today, it's $25,000 and $30,000 to get a
mm,
container across. Lack of container, lack of capacity. So, as you say, the brick and mortar solid, assets near points of entry, points of distribution have become key.
mm,
The distribution model has also changed somewhat. Amazon has sort of changed that and how product gets distributed.
mm,
I don't know if you look around Montreal or Toronto, some of the big distribution facilities that they've set up. Well, those are huge tracts of land, as you say, near highways, near rail, near infrastructure. So that will continue as retail consumption changes. Everybody, reads about and knows about how brick and mortar stores, retail stores have morphed into multi-channel, omni-channel distribution where stuff is being bought online, seen in a retail store. That is going to continue. There's been a fundamental shift, I think, in how consumers acquire goods and services. I
mm.
used to run out to my local Loblaws, Provigo to buy my groceries, and now I've just gotten used to punching away on my computer and ordering, and here it shows up on my doorstep.
Mm.
I don't see myself changing, and I think a lot of consumers are probably like me. So that's, I think, driving a lot of what you're talking about and seeing in terms of the sudden demand for those real estate assets and physical shipping.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you're bang on some of those trends, and some of them will outlast kind of the supply chain issues, and I think it's going to take some time to build out this industrial last mile real estate to fulfill the demand. Well, maybe we can get down to the micro from kind of the macro trends, and you've been in the business for quite some time. I presume that you've developed an acumen, and so if we think about it, what are maybe the three key secrets to successfully selling your business? How do potential sellers get top dollar?
I think the first thing is to be well prepared for the process, and it's a process, and you have to think through selling a business as being a process and not just an event. So the process really needs to start with a little bit of introspection on the part of the business owner, entrepreneur, in where he is today, what does he enjoy doing, what is he good at doing, and where does he want to be in 5 and 10 years. And we find a lot of entrepreneurs are good at some things, not necessarily good at other things, and don't want to do everything forever. I tell the story of a consultant that I worked with on many mandates, and he was a fix-it guy. When a business would come in to get into trouble, he'd get it redirected and back on its feet. And what he always said, the hardest thing on earth was take a business from zero startup to $10 million in sales. You'd have
Mm,
no clue how to do that, wouldn't know what to do, how to do it, wouldn't have the stomach for it. But he could take a business from 10 million to $100 million. That he
mhm,
could do relatively easy because that's what he knew. So I
mhm,
think business owners need to think through, what are you want to do? What are you good at? Where do you see yourself? And then set up yourself. I need to start thinking about what I want to do next with my life.
mm,
The pandemic has given people the opportunity to be reflective on where they are, where their business is. So start thinking in terms of that process. And then it's a function of planning out your exit. And your exit needs to start 2 to 3 years before you think you want to have your exit. And the reason you need that lead time are for a bunch of different things that will all converge when you come to sale. So the first thing is, really, what does your business look like? What are the value drivers of the business? And how am I going to maximize my value 3 years down the road or 4 years down the road? So maybe time to start surrounding yourself. So one is that preparation process. Two, you asked me for three things, would be selecting your advisors to get you thinking throughout this process. So selecting advisors, and you're going to need an M&A lawyer, you're going to need an M&A specialist, maybe a business broker if it's a small business, and a solid accountant that understands your business. Because when you start thinking about it, you're going to need to think through, well, what are the metrics on a sale that will give me the maximum price? And the metrics could be, most businesses, it's EBITDA, so it's earnings before interest, depreciation, taxes. Could be cash flow. Some businesses in a startup phase, it could be gross revenue. But start having those discussions now to know that if you're in a world where businesses get sold based on EBITDA, well, what are the things that I can do now to prepare for in 3 years that I can maximize my EBITDA when I come to sell? So that often means taking a hard look at your business today and say, what is my growth plan? What is my growth strategy? How do I make myself attractive to a buyer 3 years down the road? Well, the first thing that usually means is getting your house in order. So make sure your legal framework, organizational framework is up to order. Is your minute book up to date? Is all your documentation in place? Have you secured the contractual arrangements around your business? So, because when somebody comes to buy 3 years down the road, he's going to want to see that you actually own your property free of title or with title, that you've got a proper lease in place, that your employees have employment agreements, that they have non-compete agreements, non-solicitation agreements. Because the person that's buying 3 years down the road, the assumption is that that business is going to keep on going forever and be in a growth mode. So if you don't have your employees locked up, if you don't have your premises locked up, I went through a deal, one of the first deals I did about, 20 years ago, was a 7-store retail chain. And we got to closing, and as you go part of a due diligence process where you essentially take off your clothes and the buyer looks at everything, we realized, because he'd asked for copies of all our retail leases for the stores, because without the stores you don't have anything, right? And 3 of the six or 7 stores, the leases were coming up for renewal in the next 6-7 months. So the buyer wasn't going to commit to buying that business until we had gotten all those lease renewals in place. So it's a little awkward if you go in to negotiate a transaction with the landlord and he knows you're going to sell because you've been shopping the business, to start negotiating your lease. So you've lost your leverage. It's the same thing with trying to nail employees down and getting proper employment contracts in place, non-solicitation clauses, non-competition clauses. The buyer's going to look for that down the road. So I think you'd have to sort of work on that whole organizational, legal, structural part. If you're buying a product from a particular supplier, well, you better get your distribution agreements tied down, because the buyer is going to say, why would I pay top dollar for this business if your main supply contract could be canceled on 6 months' notice? So try and get those long-term contracts in place early in the process. So that's sort of the next piece that I would sort of work on is let's build this business so that it will last. So let's make sure we've got that together. The next sort of piece of it that you need to deal with is, what are your skeletons in the closet? Every business has skeletons. Is it a lawsuit that's been dragging forever, a potential employee issue? Is it something in my financial statements? So common thing that we see with small, medium-sized businesses, that their financials are subject to some bias. And if you're a very profitable business, you tend to try and reduce your profits to save on income taxes. Or if you're struggling a little bit, you're trying to make your results look better to please the bank or the lender. Well, that could be a smart strategy if it's only you and you're going to be owning this thing forever. But if you look at a scenario where you've purposely done your best to bring down profits to save taxes, and your business may be sold at 6 times EBITDA in 3 years, well, you're hurting yourself. $500,000, say you've depressed your earnings, is saving you 27% in income taxes, right? So roughly $120,000 of income tax saving. But that $500,000, if you're selling, just cost you $3 million on the sales price. So you need to start to normalize your numbers and bring all these things out before you get into that sales process. The buyer's going to look at long-term trends from the past. They'll be paying particular attention to your last trailing 12 months, and they'll be looking at the future projections. Always easier to say to the buyer, this is what it is. You lose credibility if you have to go to your buyer and say, yeah, well, we showed $500,000, but it's really $1 million. Trust me, this is real. The buyer can only go with what he sees on paper. So get your financial house in order, speak to your accountant, consider whether or not you should have upgraded financial statements if you're just doing basic statements without disclosure. Should you be looking at accounting standards for private enterprise, have a review done, perhaps an audit? If the buyer may be foreign, should you be looking at international financial standards? Start working through that process. That's going to take 3 years to get that in order. Start thinking through, what are the decisions I'm making now in my day-to-day business that may impact positively or negatively my earnings or my sales or whatever the sales metric is in 3 years when I come to actually sell my business. Those decisions have to be made now to get that in order. Start thinking through the financial leverage in your business. Whatever cash you can take out now, either, typically we'll pay up a dividend to tax-free to a holding company, may be additional value to you. A buyer looks at what is required in terms of working capital to run this business. So it's much smarter if you can run your business on less working capital, less cash, less inventory, less receivables, and take that excess money out of the company. It's extra money to you in your pocket, and it lowers the perceived acquisition cost to the buyer. So start thinking in terms of running your company a little leaner, a little tighter. Don't sacrifice the business. Like, I'm not saying, don't invest in this piece of software or this piece of equipment. Do the right things for the business, but start thinking in terms of operating leaner. If you're a sole shareholder and you've been putting through some discretionary expenditures, travel, cars, things like that, maybe now's the time to think twice about that. When we come to actually sell, we put together what's called a normalized earnings. So we'll take the earnings from the past year or projected and then adjust for one-off items. We spent this money, we spent that money, we had this litigation, the special legal fees. So we add it back. Much easier if you don't have very many of those items. The buyer just starts to lose interest and confidence, and more for them to verify. So try and keep it as clean and as simple when you come to sell. Other piece is perhaps some tax planning that you need to do to get ready to actually sell your business. A lot of tax plans will take 2 and 3 years to put into place and make sure that they're effective for you. A very,
Hmm.
very often planning technique used for private companies is to plan to use their enhanced small business capital gains exemption of
Hmm.
approximately 850,000. It's indexed, it goes up every year. So how to plan for that requires a tax specialist early on in the game. And if you've got other family members, you're able to multiply that capital gains exemption. So you might have a business that's worth $5 million, but if you've got a wife and 3 or 4 kids, you may be able to plan so all that proceeds are tax free to you. But it takes at least 2 years to put that in place. So deal with the skeletons, start dealing with what is your balance sheet and income statement going to look like when you come to sell. Do some tax planning. Make sure your corporate house is in order, that when you come to sell, the buyer knows exactly what he's getting. If he's buying employees, well, you need employment contracts. If he's buying intellectual property, make sure you've got title to that intellectual property. Maybe you should start looking at filing some patents. I sold the
Hmm.
business, oh, it must have been about 7 or 8 years ago. They were in the technology business, and they were actually a spin out of McGill University. And they had acquired some of the intellectual property from McGill at the time. But there was sort of a loosey goosey agreement with the university on who owned the business, the intellectual property. There was royalty payments being made. It was time to actually get some really strong intellectual property lawyers involved to make sure that we had full and clean title and a clear statement from the university that we actually own this intellectual property. You don't want
Hmm.
to go down the road of a transaction and then find you've got a weak link, because the buyer is going to come back and either walk away or renegotiate your deal.
So that's great, Andrew. Thank you very much. I think that provides a lot of insights where novices just very simply wouldn't need these things. I can say, having been on the other side of these transactions as a buyer for some years, I think the financials are critical. And when you get to the point where you're really serious about selling, then it has to be audited, and you have to make all of these adjustments for quality of earnings that always occur in private businesses. I was wondering the kind of the other side of that. Um, in 2 or 3 minutes, what would you say are the key mistakes that novices make when they're trying to sell their business? So, what are the 2 or 3 things that people should try to avoid?
You need to have your data ready. Once a buyer gets serious, he's going to, he may make you an offer, he may ask you for some data. So you need to show them that your shop is well organized and that you
Hmm.
can provide the data. I tell people, start preparing the data room now. So the buyer has a due diligence checklist, have all the data ready, have it all scrubbed before. So another error I see made often is not knowing your price. Speak
Mm.
to your advisors, your professionals. You have to know what your price is, what you'd like, what's the lowest you would take, what's the deal terms you will take. Buyers will try and trick you and give you your price, but not give you the deal terms you want. To get $5
Mm.
million for a business, $500,000 today, and the rest payable in 10 years may not be such a good deal, even if you got your price. So
Mm.
think that one through. Other errors I see made by vendors is overall letting their ego get in the way. What the
Mm.
buyer wants essentially is a business that can run without the vendor or the entrepreneur that started that business. So often, entrepreneurs are proud of the business. So they always talk of, I did this, I did this, I did that. that kills them when they come to negotiate the deal. You have to make yourself in the background in terms of the business and have the right people in place that the business can run without you. Maybe not immediately, but in 6 months, a year. Otherwise, the buyer is going to say, oh, this business is really just John and not anybody else.
No, that definitely makes sense. And would there be any recent tax changes that potential sellers should take into account, or maybe just some big parts of the tax code that are really kind of critical to a successful transaction?
There have been some changes in terms of the treatment of goodwill, and capital gains are being tweaked all the time, and some of the more aggressive tax plans. But I wouldn't say anything that significant. Most of the planning is around capital gains exemption, being able to remove as much money as you can by tax-free dividends to a holding company. I think that's where most of the work is that we're seeing being done right now. I tell people, don't let the tax get in the way. Eventually you're going to have to pay the tax. Mm-hmm. Our capital gain rates aren't so high right now. You're paying essentially 26%. You still could be left with a lot of money in your pocket if you get the right price. So work on creating value and getting the right price. A lot of people are scared right now that capital gains rates may go up in the next budget or in the next year. Somehow the government needs to pay for all the handouts they've had throughout the pandemic. I personally don't think that's coming for at least a year. There will be something. There has to be, whether it's a capital gains rate, a wealth tax, some other sort of tax that comes down the road. I wouldn't rush out and sell right now because I think that's coming down the road. But we'll see,
Mm-hmm. And are there any government programs that are, quite useful to either the seller or that can be mentioned to the buyer so that they would be willing to pay more money?
So about almost 15 years ago, both the federal government and the Quebec government were really concerned that there were a lot of Quebec and Canadian businesses that were not being transitioned to the next generation as they were in the past. So there are a number of programs right now from people like Investissement Québec, Fonds de Solidarité, labor-sponsored venture capital, Investissement Québec, some of the banks that have these so-called business transition programs to allow you to transition the business to a family member, to an employee buyout group, another possible exit avenue. There's certainly money available to a buyer to acquire businesses. I mentioned all the cash flow loans that are being done now, and private banks are in that market too. BDC's always been there. They've always been there on the real estate piece of things. The labor-sponsored venture capital funds have been there to do it. So yes, there is lots of money out there from governmental, quasi-governmental businesses out there. A new thing that we're seeing the last 5 years more and more, these so-called dividend recapitalizations, where you've got a successful business. Let's say you're making $3 million of cash flow EBITDA a year, and you're not ready to sell, but you'd like to deleverage yourself in that business, take some risk off the table, have some money in your holding company to diversify your portfolio. So banks will come along and lend you 3-4 times your EBITDA that you can then pay yourself a dividend. So if your business is making $3 million a year, you can negotiate a deal with the bank, borrow $7-8 million from the bank, say, and pay yourself a big tax-free dividend to your holding company. And then you can invest in whatever you want, whether it's real estate, a portfolio stock. And that's another way of diversifying your risk, because most entrepreneurs, 98% of the risk is in their business. And nothing is risk-free, as you know, Joseph. So another smart strategy that didn't exist years ago.
Okay. No, that's very insightful and very very interesting. I think that could be useful to a lot of Northland's clients, because a lot of them, are entrepreneurs. I was just wondering, is there anything we missed? A minute or two to kind of wrap things up, or anything that we may have not gone over?
No, I think we've pretty much covered everything. It's planning, having the right people around you, accountants, lawyer, M&A professional. Plan early for the transaction. Get your house in order. Get your head in order. Where do you want to be? And start thinking of your business where you're the investor and you're not the guy running the business. There was a great book that was written, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 years ago, something called The E-Myth. And what the author recommends to entrepreneurs is that stop thinking of working in the business, but start working on the business. So you're not in there doing the minutia, you're at that 10,000 foot level and you're thinking through, how do I improve my business? How do I grow my business? How do I make it more profitable? That's what's going to get you to the best exit possible under your terms and your timing for a deal that you will be happy with, to let you go on and do something else. And that's what I mean about getting your head in order. Where do you want to be and what do you want to do?
Well, thank you so much for your time, Andrew. You're always welcome at Northland. We look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you, Joseph. My pleasure, and happy to speak again whenever you guys want me. Thanks.